In recent days, the situation surrounding the city of Kupiansk has taken an unexpected turn, one that has shaken even the most steadfast supporters of the Kremlin's narrative. For weeks, pro-Russian channels and commentators had been repeating the same confident refrain, that Kupiansk was fully under Russian control, that reports of Ukrainian presence were nothing but fabrications. Yet, as time often proves, the truth has a way of breaking through layers of denial. Today, the illusion has crumbled, and the story unfolding in Kupiansk has become a symbol of how propaganda eventually collapses under the weight of reality. At first, the Russian side insisted that the Ukrainian president's appearance near Kupiansk was staged. Claims circulated online that the video was doctored, that President Zelensky had never been anywhere near the front lines. These narratives spread quickly through major Z channels, echoed by military bloggers and state-aligned commentators. Meanwhile, President Vladimir Putin continued to reassure his audience, during a televised Q&A, that Russian forces maintained control over every inch of the area. But as local reports began emerging, even from within Russia's own information space, the carefully constructed image started to falter. For days, major pro-Kremlin channels tried to maintain their composure. However, reality was pressing in. Ukrainian forces had pushed forward, nearly completing a sweeping clearance of Kupiansk's western districts. Drone footage, ground reports, and intercepted messages painted a picture starkly different from Moscow's triumphant statements. One by one, Russian military correspondents began to acknowledge what could no longer be denied, that the city many had celebrated as liberated had, in fact, slipped away. Still, the intrigue deepened. Prominent Z-bloggers began to speak cautiously, using words like unstable situation and localized setbacks, avoiding the blunt truth. They described difficulties on the ground and complex operational circumstances, yet the tone was one of growing unease. Even some of the most loyal propagandists found themselves cornered by undeniable evidence. One major channel with close ties to the Russian Ministry of Defense, Rybar, published a post titled, "Problems in Kupiansk Direction." The words that followed were unusually candid. Testimonies of false reports, of territorial losses disguised as victories, of ground commanders pressured to deliver good news, at any cost. That, perhaps, is where the story takes its sharpest turn. What seemed like a routine update from a battlefield became an accidental confession of a larger pattern, the fabrication of success. Rybar noted that much of the so-called liberated area existed only on paper, entire villages that were never truly secured, zones held by small reconnaissance groups briefly before being retaken by Ukrainian units. The report mentioned that sections of the front west of the Oskil River had been abandoned, that Ukrainian forces had regained ground around Kondrashivka and Rodkivka. The situation, as they put it, was worse than critical. Slowly, fragments of truth began to align. Maps previously shaded in Russian red began to fade as new coordinates arrived. Telegram channels, once bursting with victorious declarations, grew quiet or shifted their focus to distant topics. Soldiers on the ground described chaos and confusion. Units told to hold lines that no longer existed, reinforcements promised but never arriving. False reports had created a chain reaction that reached the highest levels, leading to disastrous decisions made in Moscow on faulty intelligence. Reserves were redirected elsewhere, leaving Kupiansk underdefended. And as the silence broke, anger replaced denial. Voices that once echoed official optimism turned bitter. "Why were we lied to?" one post read. Another added, "Those reports weren't just wrong, they cost lives." Even the staunchest supporters of the Kremlin's war effort began to fracture, realizing that the stories they had shared, repeated, and believed were never meant to reflect reality. In the midst of this collapse, one thing became clear. Kupiansk was no longer a local setback, it was a mirror. A mirror reflecting how the Russian information system sustains itself not through truth, but through constant, deliberate fabrication. The same voices that once celebrated heroic captures were now questioning how long the deception could continue. How many more victories would be announced over territories that no longer exist under their control? Before moving to the core of what truly happened in Kupiansk, the deeper unraveling of command, the loss of trust inside the Russian ranks, and the growing panic within the propaganda ecosystem, let's pause for a moment. If you're following this investigation, make sure you're subscribed and stay tuned, because what you're about to hear next will reveal not just the truth about one battle, but about the entire system that built its empire on illusions. The real story of Kupiansk, and what it means for Russia's war narrative, begins now. The real story of Kupiansk begins not with a single battle, but with a chain of deception that spread through every level of the Russian command structure. For months, the Russian Ministry of Defense reported steady progress in the Kupiansk direction. These reports were broadcast across state television, repeated by officials, and magnified through telegram channels that served as unofficial arms of propaganda. But as investigations and testimonies from within the Russian ranks now show, the supposed victories were built entirely on falsified data, on field reports rewritten to please Moscow. The names of key towns, Kondrashivka, Radkivka, Petropavlivka, Kucherivka, were used as symbols of conquest. In reality, they were slipping back under Ukrainian control, one after another, while generals in Moscow continued to submit congratulatory briefings. One striking example came from the so-called Rybar channel, a telegram network with over 1 million subscribers, long known for its alignment with the Russian Ministry of Defense. Its administrators, usually cautious, broke ranks to admit that what was happening under Kupiansk was a reflection of a systemic failure. They wrote about false battlefield maps, the manipulation of drone footage, and staged videos meant to demonstrate control over areas that Russian troops had already vacated. The channel compared the situation to the disastrous failures of the previous year in the Siversk direction, only in significantly larger scale. It became a symbol of how Russia's own information operations had turned against its army, blinding decision-makers with comforting lies. At the heart of the scandal was a simple truth. The Russian army had never fully secured Kupiansk. Reports of liberation were premature, based on brief incursions and partial occupations of industrial zones. A particularly revealing example concerned the Kupiansk milk canning factory, a massive complex on the eastern edge of the city. Official statements described it as a stronghold, but according to ground sources, Ukrainian forces had regained control there weeks before Moscow acknowledged it. That facility's fall was more than symbolic. It was the last logistical artery that connected the Russian grouping on the west bank of the Oskil River. Once it was lost, the entire network of supply and communication collapsed, forcing a chaotic withdrawal that left many soldiers stranded or unaccounted for. For Russian military correspondents, this became a breaking point. Even loyal propagandists like two majors, who had spent months echoing official optimism, admitted the grim truth. Kupiansk is problematic. Reports from the ground confirm that the situation is worse than previously thought. Their posts revealed that Ukrainian drone operations had intensified, that the Russians were struggling to maintain even minimal aerial surveillance, and that units cut off from the main forces were being shelled into retreat. This acknowledgement, subtle but unmistakable, marked a turning moment. When those who once served as voices of state triumph begin speaking of critical setbacks, the narrative begins to crack. Meanwhile, analysts across Telegram began piecing together a larger story, that the chain of lies had begun at the top. Vladimir Putin had been briefed in November that Kupiansk was under Russian control, and General Valery Gerasimov personally reported that the city had been cleared. Awards were distributed, medals granted, even a Hero of Russia title issued for the operation. Yet soldiers on the front were already communicating to their families that the city was, at best, contested. By mid-December, when President Zelensky appeared at the Kupiansk city sign to record a video message, the propaganda machine moved into overdrive. Pro-Russian commentators called it a fake, an edited clip, a psychological operation. But within days, when Russian military channels themselves began acknowledging heavy fighting in those same areas, the denial became untenable. The unraveling was public and painful. Prominent figures in the Z community turned on one another. Who lied, and for what purpose? Rebar asked rhetorically, followed by his own answer. Because the leadership trades in illusions. The admission was brutal. The Kremlin's war effort depended on the sale of false victories, not to the West, but to its own people. It was about maintaining morale, sustaining the image of progress, persuading citizens that sacrifices were justified. The illusion of control was the product being sold to both domestic audiences and to foreign interlocutors like Donald Trump, whom Russian officials hoped to convince of Russia's strength. But illusions cannot hold forever, and when they fall, they expose not only the weakness of the army, but the fragility of the entire political system that built its legitimacy on them. By late December, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. Reports surfaced that Russia had lost almost the entire Kupiansk bridgehead, that its positions on the western bank of the Oskil River had collapsed, and that the remaining troops had been pulled back under the pretext of tactical regrouping. The phrase, familiar from previous retreats, had become a synonym for defeat. Even the notoriously loyal war correspondent Yuri Podolyaka, who had once mocked claims of Ukrainian advances, was forced to admit, Ukrainians have entered most of Kupiansk. It's unpleasant to report this, but it must be said. His admission spread like wildfire through Russian telegram, signaling that the last barrier of silence had fallen. Other voices followed. The empire is furious, wrote the channel Imperia Ochen Zla. Kupiansk is lost, yet medals were already distributed. This tone, a mixture of rage and exhaustion, revealed how the community that once amplified the Kremlin's messages had turned against it. Bloggers complained about the endless cycle of victories on television that never matched the reality seen on battlefield maps. Soldiers wrote privately about being sent to hold positions that were already surrounded. Some posts described how units were ordered to film short clips declaring control over certain streets, only for those same streets to fall within hours. The deception had become absurd, self-defeating, and deadly. But perhaps the most damning testimony came from a Belarusian military source operating alongside Russian forces. He described how Russian units were routinely sent to occupy red-marked positions on the map, areas marked as Ukrainian held. The tactic was cynical. Ukrainian defenders would temporarily retreat, allowing Russian troops to move in and film footage. Then, once they had done so, Ukrainian artillery and drones would strike back, destroying the position. The videos were sent up the chain as proof of success, but the territory reverted immediately. On paper, we held the ground, the Belarusian soldier wrote, but in reality, control was only for a few hours. Reports were adjusted to fit the narrative, not the truth. This culture of deceit was not new. Analysts reminded viewers that similar patterns had occurred in previous offensives: inflated maps, misreported captures, and false claims of stabilization. The problem, they argued, was structural. Officers were rewarded for good news, not accurate reports. Promotions, bonuses, even safety from punishment depended on delivering optimism. The result was an army trapped in its own fiction. When the truth finally surfaced, it was devastating. Kupiansk had not been taken in November, as Moscow claimed. It had merely been entered, briefly, before Russian forces were pushed back. And by the end of December, it was once again under full Ukrainian control. The reaction within Russia's pro-war ecosystem was telling. Some, like Yulia Vityazeva from Solovyov's network, insisted that it was irrelevant what is happening on the ground. What matters is that no one talks about it. Others, like the war reporter Romanov, broke rank to state the obvious. Kupiansk is gone. Most of the city is under Ukrainian forces. Beautiful reports, disgraceful results. Even military figures began to express frustration, saying that their superiors preferred to be lied to than to face reality. What began as quiet frustration had turned into open criticism, and that in itself was extraordinary in the tightly controlled world of Russian propaganda. As the news spread, the contrast between Moscow's silence and the frontline testimonies became too stark to ignore. The Kremlin continued to broadcast stories of resilience and counterattacks, but the digital battlefield told a different story. Maps showing Ukrainian progress, intercepted communications describing withdrawals, and local civilians confirming the presence of Ukrainian troops. The deeper one looked, the clearer it became that the Kupiansk success had been an invention, and that invention had now imploded. And in that implosion lies the core of this entire episode. A war fought not only with weapons, but with words, where falsehoods are as strategic as missiles, and where losing control of the narrative can be as catastrophic as losing a city itself. Kupiansk became the place where the machinery of propaganda broke down under its own contradictions. The myth of invincibility was replaced by confusion, anger, and disbelief. What happens when a system built on deceit begins to believe its own lies? The answer is Kupiansk. Stay with me, because in the next part, we will go deeper into the consequences of this deception, how it reshaped the Russian information landscape, the reaction of international observers, and what this episode reveals about the future of the war itself. As the dust settled over Kupiansk and the shock waves spread through Russia's information ecosystem, the consequences of the deception began to take shape. This was no longer a local embarrassment or a single military blunder. It was the exposure of an entire structure built on lies, the unraveling of a system that could no longer distinguish between propaganda and reality. Inside the Russian Federation, among soldiers, analysts, and ordinary citizens, the fallout was immediate and profound. The news that Kupiansk was again under Ukrainian control, after months of official claims to the contrary, struck at the very heart of the Kremlin's narrative of steady advance. It revealed, with stunning clarity, that those in charge had not only lost ground on the battlefield, but also control of their own story. In Moscow, officials avoided direct comment. The Ministry of Defense issued a brief statement referring to localized regrouping near Kupiansk and emphasizing that the front line remains stable. But the truth had already escaped their grasp. Satellite images confirmed Ukrainian presence in the city center, and videos from local residents, posted online despite censorship, showed Ukrainian flags over administrative buildings. Independent observers verified the footage, geolocated it, and published their findings across international media. Suddenly, the narrative that Russia had built for domestic consumption crumbled under the weight of verifiable fact. Western outlets like Reuters, BBC, and The Guardian picked up the story, while even some state-linked Russian outlets quietly edited previous articles, removing or rewriting earlier claims about Kupiansk's liberation. Within the Russian pro-war community, the reaction was explosive. The Z bloggers, who once formed a loyal propaganda vanguard, turned their anger inward. Channels that had been tools of the state now accused generals and political leaders of treachery. "They lied to us, they lied to you, and they lied to the president," one post declared, gathering hundreds of thousands of views before being deleted. Another blogger wrote, "The tragedy of Kupiansk is not the loss of territory, it is the loss of trust." What began as whispered frustration had become a chorus of disillusionment. Soldiers on the front lines, realizing how deeply they had been misled, began leaking private messages describing chaos, poor coordination, and a leadership more concerned with optics than survival. The internal contradictions of the war effort were laid bare. Officers reported to superiors what they thought those superiors wanted to hear, and in turn, generals tailored their reports for the Kremlin. No one wanted to be the bearer of bad news, so every retreat became a maneuver, every stalemate a strategic pause. Kupiansk exposed this feedback loop in its purest form, a chain of falsehoods so complete that even those within it could no longer see the truth. By late December, multiple military analysts concluded that the Russian command structure had effectively blinded itself. The consequences were not limited to Kupiansk. The same mechanisms of self-deception had played out in Kremlin, Avdiivka, and along the Siversky Donets line, each time repeating the same pattern of exaggerated gains, followed by humiliating reversals. In Kyiv, the Ukrainian leadership treated the developments with measured restraint. President Volodymyr Zelensky, whose visit to the Kupiansk area had initially triggered the storm of denials from Moscow, spoke briefly about the liberation during a press conference, saying that truth always prevails, even when buried under propaganda. His remarks, calm and understated, were widely shared online. Ukrainian media emphasized that the battle was not just a military event, but a psychological turning point. Evidence that Russian command could no longer maintain coherence between words and actions. For Ukraine, Kupiansk became a symbol of perseverance and information discipline. For Russia, it became a symbol of implosion. The international reaction mirrored that divide. Western analysts called Kupiansk a microcosm of the wider war, a demonstration of how misinformation corrodes strategy from within. Experts at the Institute for the Study of War described the incident as a self-inflicted operational failure caused by an obsession with political optics. European officials noted that Russia's pattern of exaggeration and denial had undermined its credibility even among its remaining allies. Inside diplomatic circles, whispers spread that Moscow's internal reports on other fronts might be equally unreliable, leaving foreign partners uncertain about the real state of the war. The loss of informational control, once considered impossible for the Kremlin, had become a reality. Meanwhile, voices from within Russia's own system began to hint at dissent. Military insiders, speaking anonymously to independent outlets, described an atmosphere of paranoia at the general staff. "No one wants to admit that they knew," one source said. "Everyone pretends to be surprised, but everyone also knew." The same source described a growing fear among mid-level officers that revealing the truth could mean dismissal, or worse. The hierarchy had turned defensive, prioritizing self-preservation over effectiveness. This culture of silence meant that lessons from Kupiansk were unlikely to be learned. The same errors, driven by the same politics of denial, were destined to repeat. Among civilians, the mood was shifting. Russian social media, despite censorship, began to fill with questions. How could so many official briefings have been false? Why had state television shown maps that contradicted reality? Why had medals been handed out for victories that never happened? Even among those who still supported the war, frustration was growing. The sense that the leadership had lost touch with reality was spreading. Comment sections under pro-government posts turned increasingly skeptical, with users quoting the old saying, "They lie to the Tsar lies to the people, and the people lie to themselves." Kupiansk had revived that sentiment on a national scale. In the broader picture, the Kupiansk episode became a lesson in the limits of control. The Russian state had built an entire information architecture designed to suppress truth and amplify illusion, yet it could not withstand the collision with observable facts. Drones, satellite imagery, and eyewitness accounts formed an alternative reality that no censorship could erase. In a world connected by digital evidence, propaganda can only delay exposure, not prevent it. And when exposure comes, it arrives all at once, devastatingly. This realization has begun to reshape how analysts, journalists, and even ordinary viewers interpret the flow of war information. Kupiansk was not merely a defeat in Ukraine. It was a revelation about how the modern information war is fought and lost. Inside Russia's propaganda ecosystem, desperate attempts were made to redirect the narrative. Television hosts such as Vladimir Solovyov and Olga Skabieva reverted to their usual rhetoric, blaming Western psychological operations for distorting the perception of events. Yet their voices, once unchallenged, now sounded defensive. Even loyal commentators could not ignore that major Z channels, once coordinated with the Ministry of Defense, had broken ranks. That fracture signified more than disagreement. It signaled the fragmentation of an entire ideological machine. Each channel began seeking its own version of the truth, trying to preserve its credibility with followers while avoiding direct confrontation with the state. The coherence that had defined Russia's propaganda early in the war was gone. Among Russian analysts abroad, figures like Igor Girkin, Strelkov, still active online despite his imprisonment, seized on the chaos to attack the leadership. In his posts, he wrote that Kupiansk proved the total incompetence of the command and predicted that similar disasters would follow in Lyman, Svatove, and Tokmak. His words, once considered fringe, gained traction among disillusioned nationalists who no longer trusted official sources. It was an extraordinary reversal. Propaganda, which had once unified, was now dividing. The same channels that had helped sustain the illusion of victory were now fueling internal dissent. Kupiansk had turned the tools of control into weapons of criticism. By early January, independent researchers estimated that Russian territorial control in northeastern Ukraine had shrunk to less than it was in mid-2022. The symbolic power of that statistic was immense. 4 years into the invasion, after hundreds of thousands of casualties and immense material losses, the Kremlin had less land than it had at the war's beginning. Kupiansk became shorthand for that futility, a name invoked by commentators, soldiers, and satirists alike to describe the hollow victories and cyclical narratives of the conflict. Kupiansk syndrome, as one Russian analyst termed it, meant the inability of a regime to admit loss even when surrounded by evidence of it. As the story spread across platforms, a larger truth emerged. The Russian leadership's dependence on deception was not a wartime invention, but a continuation of decades-old political culture. The system that lied about elections, economics, and crises now lied about battlefields with the same precision. Kupiansk was simply where those lies met an unyielding opponent, both military and informational. The Ukrainian command's transparency, daily updates, and evidence-based communication created a stark contrast to Moscow's secrecy. That contrast eroded Russian credibility not only abroad, but at home, where information consumers began to rely more on open-source intelligence than on official statements. In the end, Kupiansk's story is more than a chapter in a military chronicle. It is a case study in the anatomy of denial. It shows how propaganda can win the short-term battle for perception, yet lose the long-term war for truth. It reveals that in modern conflicts, control of narrative is as fragile as control of terrain, and once lost, it rarely returns. For Russia, the collapse of the Kupiansk myth marked the moment when the facade of omnipotence cracked,